Welcome. In this video, we'll be analyzing Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 to 39. These verses provide us with a description of Antiochus IV. But what truly makes these verses fascinating isn't so much their content, but rather their position in the text. As right before this description of Antiochus, we have a very thorough and accurate account of history. And then directly after this description of Antiochus, we have an inaccurate account of history. So verses 36 to 39 separate the accurate from the inaccurate history. And as we've spoken about in previous videos, most scholars will claim that the book of Daniel was written in this time period, so about 165 BC. And that does make a lot of sense, since it explains why verses 3 to 35 are historically accurate, because Daniel is accurately recording past events. And it also explains why verses 40 to 45 are historically incorrect, as Daniel inaccurately predicts future events. In describing verses 36 to 39 and their placement in the text, Newsom writes the following in her commentary. These verses interrupt the historical narration in order to focus on the person of Antiochus, and in particular, his relationship with deity. They come at a strategic place, since the final section, verses 40 to 45, contains the actual historical prediction based on the understanding of the dynamics of divinely determined history developed throughout the chapter. Newsom continues to write, quote, "What these verses serve to explain is why the pattern of containment will be ruptured. Previous kings had challenged one another, but now this king has challenged heavenly powers," end quote. So, as Newsom writes, the reason why we have a description of Antiochus here is because Daniel needs to demonstrate that Antiochus is so much worse than his predecessors. So remember our timeline here. Daniel 11 has recorded the consistent conflicts between the northern and southern kings. And the kings that ruled during this period were sinful men, as they were challenging their fellow kings. But now Antiochus IV comes on the scene. And he doesn't merely challenge men, but rather he challenges God himself. Thus, verses 36 to 39 present Antiochus as more evil than his predecessors, which ruptures history and ushers in the apocalypse. Okay, it's now time to read verse 36. It reads, quote, "The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed, for what is determined shall be done." End quote. Now, one of the most obvious ways that Antiochus exalted himself was his title Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means God manifest. Now, while all of Antiochus' predecessors also had titles, none were as blasphemous as his own. For instance, his brother Seleucus IV was known as Philopater, which means father lover. His grandfather, Seleucus III, was known as Soranus, meaning thunderbolt, and his great-grandfather, Seleucus II, was known as Cassinius, meaning beautiful victor. Hopefully you can see that Antiochus' title of God Manifest is starkly different from his predecessors, and incredibly blasphemous, especially from a Jewish point of view. Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "More significantly, although the title God, Greek theos, had been previously used to honor Seleucid monarchs, Antiochus IV was the first to exploit this designation as a part of his popular image." She continues to write, "Some of his coins used the title, quote, Basilius Antiochus Theo Epiphanes. I do not speak Greek. I'm sure I mispronounced every word there. But what that means is Antiochus the king, God manifest." Newsom continues to write, "Since coins were a major means by which imperial self-representation was propagated, it would be likely that the author of Daniel was aware of these claims and considered them blasphemous." End quote. Let's now spend some time analyzing some of Antiochus' coins. And what we're going to see is that the coins created early in his reign were not blasphemous, but then over time they became very blasphemous. For instance, when we look at this early coin and we have a look at the back of it, and we look at the inscription, we can see we have the words Basilius, which means king, and Antiochus. So King Antiochus. Nothing very blasphemous there, just kind of stating the facts. But now let's put that coin away and look at a coin produced later on in his reign. We'll have a look at the back inscription, and we're still going to see Basilius Antiochus, so King Antiochus, but now we have another title added to it. And what this says is God manifest. So as you can see, as time progresses, his coins are becoming more blasphemous. Let's now put this one away and look at our final coin here, one produced later on in his reign. And again, when looking at the back inscription, we have King Antiochus again. We also have God manifest, but now Antiochus has added yet another title for himself. You can see it right here. Again, I do not speak Greek. I do not know how to pronounce that, but it says Nikophos, which means victory bringer. And this was actually a designation that Zeus used to describe himself. So again, even more blasphemous. So hopefully you can see here that Antiochus's coins start off not very blasphemous, but then over time become very blasphemous. As the following author writes, quote, "The inscriptions on Antiochus IV coins provide a background to this verse. The early coins have the simple inscription of King Antiochus. This gradually expands to of King Antiochus, God manifest victory bringer, which is found on coins from 169 BC on. Alexander the Great and his successors were given some divine honors, but Antiochus IV was the first to use the epithet God on his coins, and by adding manifest epiphanies, he strengthened the claim to identification with the deity. Victory bringer was one of the epithets used of Zeus." End quote. Let's now move on to verse 37, which reads, quote, "He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any other god, for he shall consider himself greater than all." End quote. Now, there's a lot going on in this verse, so let's just focus on the first part here. He shall pay no respect to the god of his ancestors. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, "According to the narrator, Antiochus had no consideration of the god of his ancestors, meaning probably the god Apollo, the patron deity of the Seleucids. The appearance of Zeus instead of Apollo on some of the coins minted during his reign may have suggested to some in his time that he was favoring Zeus at the expense of the god of his forebears. That may not have been Antiochus's intention in depicting Zeus, but it made for good polemics." End quote. We can again see this by looking at his coins. So if we look at an early coin from Antiochus, you can see that the image on the back is that of the god Apollo, and this was the patron god of the Seleucid Empire. But if we then look at a coin later on in his reign, we can see that instead of Apollo, we instead have the god Zeus here. So as you can see, we have this transition from the early coins having Apollo to the later coins having Zeus. Now, in the eyes of a faithful Jew, this would have been seen as a rejection of Apollo. But remember, Antiochus is a pagan and worshipped multiple gods, so this need not be some sort of rejection of Apollo. As Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "The general gist of the accusation is that Antiochus abandoned the worship of other gods, including the ancestral god of the Seleucid dynasty, Apollo. This is simply not the case. In 166, Antiochus staged a spectacular festival and procession at the sanctuary of Apollo at Daphne near Antioch. A special coin was issued honoring Apollo, and the procession featured the statues of many deities." Newsom continues to write, "It is the case, however, that the mint at Antioch, as early as 173-172, had replaced the figure of Apollo on the reverse of Antiochus's coins with the figure of a seated Zeus Olympus, though other mints retained the traditional image." Newsom continues, "Perhaps this was sufficient for the author of Daniel to have derived the impression that Antiochus's veneration of Zeus, Olympus, amounted to a rejection of Apollo, since within Judaism one could not honor a second god without betraying one's ancestral deity." End quote. Okay, let's now move on to the next part of this verse. I'll read the full verse again and highlight the part we'll be focusing on now. It says, "He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the one beloved by women." Okay, what on earth does that mean? What does it mean that he paid no respect to the one beloved by women? Well, most commentators are going to say that this is a reference to the god Tammuz, which is a Mesopotamian god. And in the Greek religion, this god was known as Adonis. And this god was primarily worshipped by women. So in the ancient world, women were known as loving or worshipping Tammuz Adonis. For instance, here is a fragment from a wedding vase showing women worshipping Adonis. Furthermore, in the Bible itself, in the book of Ezekiel, we have reference to women weeping for Tammuz, which was an act of worship to Tammuz. The book of Ezekiel reads, quote, "Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord. Women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz." End quote. So now, coming back to Daniel, when we read that Antiochus did not show respect to the one beloved by women, it must mean that Antiochus didn't respect Tammuz or Adonis. Now, this is very odd, because out of all the gods to specify, why on earth does Daniel specify that Antiochus disrespects Tammuz and Adonis? And frankly, we have no idea. Some contend that Tammuz was worshipped in the Seleucid Empire and Adonis was worshipped in the Ptolemaic Empire. Thus, Siao writes, "Moreover, the king is said to have no respect for the one whom women beloved," a probable reference to Adonis, a god venerated in Mesopotamia as Tammuz, Ezekiel 8:14, but now also favored in Ptolemaic Egypt. He continues to write, "He had no respect for either the god of the Seleucids nor the god of the Ptolemies," end quote. Now, this sounds good, but I could find no primary evidence that Tammuz was worshipped in the Seleucid Empire, nor Adonis in the Ptolemaic. And that is why Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, "That Antiochus is accused of not honoring the beloved of women, that is Tammuz Adonis, is even more odd, since there is no evidence that this deity ever had any standing within the Seleucid Empire," end quote. Okay, let's now move on to the last two verses of this section, which is unfortunately also confusing. Verse 38 reads, "He shall honor the god of fortresses instead of these, a god whom his ancestors did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts." Now, this verse is incredibly vague, and commentators really don't have much to say on it. For instance, who exactly is the god of fortresses? Well, Siao writes in his commentary, "This god must be Zeus, whom Antiochus had honored on some of his coins, although not strictly the same Greek Zeus Olympus, whom his Seleucid ancestors surely knew. Rather, the god appears to have been a bastardized version of Baal Shamim, the deity worshipped by predominantly Syrian mercenary troops garrisoned at the Acra, the fortress that Antiochus had established in Jerusalem," end quote. So what Siao is saying here is that the god of fortresses is some sort of amalgamation of the Greek god Zeus and the Syrian god Baal, which was worshipped in the Acra near the Jerusalem temple. Now, he gives us no primary evidence of this at all. He provides no evidence. He just kind of states it, which leads me to believe that it isn't true because I simply can't find anything to back it up. I think sometimes scholars just want something to say about a verse, when in some cases, we frankly have no idea what the verse is referring to. And I think this is one of those instances. We simply don't know who the god of fortresses is. I don't know where Siao came up with all of this, but here you go. This is what he's saying. Siao continues to write about verse 38, "This god was a warrior, the god of power, whom could be identified generally with any number of deities, including for Hellenistic Jews, their god. This god was a god of the mixed multitudes of all the fortresses, including the Acra. This god was a god that all of his troops at the Acra could agree on, and hence a god that served the political agenda of Antiochus well. Apparently, religion was to Antiochus nothing but a tool, a convenient means to an end," end quote. Again, this may be the correct interpretation of verse 38, but since Siao doesn't provide us any primary evidence, any inscriptions, any quotations, I really can't say that this is the true interpretation of the text. We simply don't know, and that's fine. Sometimes we just don't know. Okay, let's now move on to verse 39, which is our last verse here. It says, quote, "He shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall make more wealthy, and shall appoint them as rulers over many, and shall distribute the land for a price," end quote. Again, we're really not sure what this is referring to. It's really quite vague. When he's referring to a foreign god, this is probably referring to the god of fortresses, but again, we're not sure what exactly this is referring to. The only thing that we can kind of say concretely is that for the phrase, "he shall distribute the land for a price," we believe that we have some correspondence to this in the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q248, which we've actually spoken about in a previous video. One of the lines on this Dead Sea Scroll is, quote, "Antiochus shall come to Egypt and sell its land," end quote. So this sounds very similar to what we read in verse 39. Eshel will write the following, quote, 4Q248 has provided us with a new historical fact that Antiochus sold land in Egypt. In turn, this helps us better understand Daniel 11:39, he will distribute land for a price. In all probability, it too is alluding to the sale of land in Judea, just like the sale of Egyptian land reported in 4Q 248. End quote. Okay, and with all of that, we have reviewed verses 36 to 39 of Daniel chapter 11. Now, remember back to the beginning of this video. Daniel most likely was living during the reign of Antiochus, which is why he accurately records everything before verse 36, but is also why after verse 39, Daniel starts making mistakes, and that's because he starts making real predictions which do not turn out to be true. So in our next few videos, we're going to be delving into this inaccurate history, verses 40 to 45. I hope to see you then. As always, if you are enjoying these videos, your support is greatly appreciated, so please make sure you're supporting me on Patreon. Find the link in the description below. If donating isn't something you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. As always, thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one.